Red Bull's 2024 Formula One campaign has plunged to a new low. This is no longer a team having a difficult spell, but one that's in a full-blown crisis, with a troubled car Max Verstappen has labelled a monster. Red Bull was only the 4th fastest team in qualifying in Italy, where even the brilliance of Max Verstappen could only get the team to a frustrated 6th in the race. Team principal Christian Horner admitted the situation is not only concerning, but also confusing. And though there may finally be a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, seeing it and reaching it are very different things, and Red Bull doesn't know how long it will take. Red Bull dominated the early stages of the season, winning 7 of the first 10 races. Even when McLaren came on strong thanks to the upgrade introduced for the 6th event of the season in Miami, Verstappen was still able to win Grand Prix. But while McLaren has only got stronger since then, Red Bull is fading. For a while, Red Bull could go head-to-head with McLaren and still win, but Monza was its 6th consecutive defeat, and it was also the worst one. Monza is an atypical track with the lowest downforce on the calendar, and therefore in itself not representative of the average performance level of the cars. It's a circuit that at least should have played to the aerodynamic efficiency strength of the Red Bull though, and one where Verstappen won in both 2022 and 23. The changes to the curbs as part of the track resurfacing project were also expected to help Red Bull a little with its ride shortcomings. But by Sunday night, Horner was claiming this circuit exposed the deficiencies in the car compared to last year. It was a shock for Red Bull to qualify slowest of the 4 teams here, with Verstappen a massive 7 tenths off McLaren's Lando Norris's pole time. It serves to highlight that the pace is there in the Red Bull when it is in the sweet spot, but also how easily it gets knocked out of that, as understeer unexpectedly set in for both Verstappen and Sergio Perez in Q3. Verstappen said it made the car undrivable, while Perez likened the RB20 to a boat. Red Bull also wasn't helped by Perez ploughing through the gravel at the exit of Lesmo 2 on the final runs, pulling gravel onto the track, and meaning Verstappen was in his turbulent air through the following Ascari chicane. Red Bull didn't have a Monza-specific rear wing available, instead opting to trim out an existing low downforce one. That means it was carrying a little more downforce than rivals, which hurt straight line speed and didn't give enough back in the corners. In the race, Red Bull had nothing more to offer. Both cars started on the hard tyres with the other frontrunners on mediums, but it couldn't extend the first stint much because of graining, and then switched to an aggressive 2-stop, but still had no pace even without worrying about tyre management. Verstappen's frustrations were compounded by a slow pit stop and an issue with his energy deployment running out at the end of the straights that further demonstrated how Red Bull's previous infallibility has disappeared in every area. The only saving grace by Sunday evening was that McLaren and Norris had failed to win the Grand Prix. Red Bull was so sure-footed with car design and development across the first 2 years of the current regulations that it's almost incomprehensible for it to be all at sea now. The Red Bull RB20 didn't deliver all the expected performance gains from the off. In low and medium speed corners, improvements were made, but the car's high-speed corner performance wasn't quite as anticipated. Then there's the troubles with curb riding, a limitation dating back as far as 2022 and that Verstappen constantly complained about, but that wasn't expected to be as big a problem as it has been. The cracks were already showing before the summer break, notably in Hungary, where Verstappen was furious throughout the race, but across the Zandvoort-Monza doubleheader, the full extent of the crisis has been laid bare. The persistent problem is the poor, ever-shifting balance. Perez describes it as a disconnection in the car that means it can be quick in flashes, but not consistently. The front and rear of the car don't seem to be working together, making its behaviour unpredictable. Even Verstappen's struggling to lean on the car, but when that gets addressed, it creates understeer, which Verstappen hates. Verstappen has been pushing Red Bull hard for months that it needs to up its game, and his warnings about specific limitations go back way further. He sounds increasingly frustrated that these warnings weren't acted upon, and says Red Bull's slump from dominant to undrivable in a single season is very weird, so requires the car to be turned upside down in search of a solution. Horner reckons the current balance issues were spotted as early as Austin last year, but have been exacerbated by Red Bull's continued development. The more downforce Red Bull has added, the worse the balance between the front and the rear of the car has become. In trying to unpick the wrong turn it's taken with its development, Red Bull has conducted various in-weekend experiments. At Zandvoort, different floors were run through practice. This culminated in Verstappen deciding to switch to an early season floor for FP3 and using it in the race. We understand this was an eventuality that nobody at the factory was consulted on, and happened as a result of Verstappen's desire to rediscover the early season car balance. That didn't work, as the newer floor Perez ran was around 0.2 of a second quicker. What's more, the balance of Verstappen's car was still all over the place. Experimentation continued in Friday practice at Monza, with the older floor appearing again to gather further data from running it with the old spec, lower downforce engine cover. But come Saturday, both drivers were on the latest floor. The positive is that Red Bull has built up a lot of data from these experiments. The negative is that such desperate measures also indicate desperate times. It's also been admitted that there is a correlation problem at Red Bull, where the findings from the wind tunnel don't necessarily line up with the findings from the track. But while Horner says that means you can't trust your tools and admits the tunnel's limitations are why Red Bull's invested in a brand new one, he insists it's not the reason for the problems being faced right now. There is the question of whether Red Bull has been hurt by the absence of Adrian Newey, who was last on site at a race in July and stepped back from real F1 involvement in early May, when his resignation was announced. Newey's also not the only senior figure to have moved on, as the loss of Rob Marshall to McLaren might also have had an effect. While Newey was not the day-to-day technical leader, his input was crucial in setting Red Bull's design direction. Horner's adamant that Newey's retreat would not have impacted Red Bull so significantly so quickly. Verstappen doubts it too, but he did point out that last year Red Bull had the most dominant car ever, and we basically turned that into a monster. And there was talk at the start of the season that the RB20 went in a direction Newey wasn't entirely on board with. So would Red Bull be better off if it had something more overtly Newey approved? And is its troubleshooting being hindered by the absence of his pragmatic engineering-led presence? There are clearly layers of issues, but it's probably worth noting that when it comes to suggestions that Red Bull has been held back by being forced to change something on its car by the FIA, experiments like the ones we've seen at recent races wouldn't be the consequence of that. Red Bull's actively trying to rediscover a car balance it had earlier in the year, a futile task if the team knew it was the result of an enforced change like the much talked about asymmetric braking clarification. Red Bull is clearly in a hole technically. The question is, how deep? It could be that Red Bull will turn up for the next race in Azerbaijan, bolt on a load of bits and be back at the front, but that doesn't seem likely. Perez says that Red Bull doesn't have a quick fix and the focus is on making the best out of what it currently has. There was at least a feeling in the team that these tricky weekends after the summer break has helped it achieve some clarity in the right direction to go in. Horner was clinging to an optimistic outlook. He hinted that the issue was finally understood and suggested certain fixes can potentially be introduced, perhaps not to resolve the whole issue, but address some of it. The fact that experiments were ongoing at Zandvoort and Monza, along with the pessimism from its drivers, suggests that's not going to happen imminently. If the short gap to Baku and Singapore now isn't enough time, then the unusual mini break in the calendar from mid-September to mid-October will be absolutely critical. Maybe what can be addressed in the short term will be enough this year to get over the line before a bigger reworking for the RB21 in 2025 is possible. Red Bull needs a real solution, and to do that, it might not only need to change the floor, but also make some tough decisions on whether innovations such as switching between the high downforce engine cover and sidepod bodywork introduced on Verstappen's car in Hungary and subsequently used at Zandvoort, and the low downforce version used at Monza are a good idea. The front wing is also an area of intrigue. Making the most of the flexibility that must be allowed in aerodynamic parts, given they can't be entirely rigid, is vital to making the cars work. It's an area where Mercedes and McLaren appear to have stolen a march on Red Bull. A change there could help Red Bull achieve a more consistent balance across a wider range of corner speeds. Red Bull's Monza struggles almost cost it the lead in the Constructors' Championship, with McLaren closing to just 8 points behind. McLaren would have already moved ahead had it not been mugged by Ferrari in the Italian Grand Prix. McLaren is now the unquestionable favourite for the Constructors' Championship, having outscored Red Bull in 9 out of the last 10 race weekends. What happened in Italy also means that Verstappen's Drivers' Championship lead is looking shakier than ever. Verstappen seemed resigned to his fate on Sunday because with how we are at the moment, we are bad everywhere, and Horner admitted both championships will be under pressure if Red Bull's performance at Monza becomes the norm. Verstappen's advantage was cut from 70 to 62 points, and while that's still a huge gap to close with only 8 races and 3 sprints left, more Monza-style weekends will make that lead evaporate. Prior to the summer break, the Drivers' Championship was only a vague hypothetical possibility for Norris and McLaren, and it's still a difficult objective, but it might be achievable. Especially with Mercedes and Ferrari drivers clearly capable of taking points off Verstappen as well. Both teams have now won more recently than Red Bull has. Norris came into the final 10 rounds needing to average 8 points more than Verstappen per event to steal the title. He's managed that at Zandvoort and Monza, even though McLaren has slightly underachieved, and hacking away bigger chunks going forward seems a distinct possibility now.